Thank you, Michael. David and I are both so grateful to have been invited back to this historic and now ever more beautiful platform. I take seriously your challenge about civil discourse, especially since our profession sits at the center of that challenge and that conversation and bears some responsibility for the state of it in our country right now. This is something David and I both take very seriously, and so there's no one I would rather interrogate on this subject. This is an unscripted conversation, unless you count the fact that we've been talking for 30 years, including last night when we were the last people in the dining room of the Athenaeum. My apologies to the staff. We've known each other since graduate school, and I followed David's career plotting relentlessly to figure out a way to bring him to time, because I was certain that his fierce intellect, which is well known to those of you who have read his books or heard him lecture here, would have an important impact on our national conversation. And he met that challenge and more, but perhaps never more so than in the last 2 years, when he was on the front lines of our coverage of this campaign and the election, and it was David who I called on election night about 8 hours before deadline, saying, I think we're going to need a new story. So you can imagine my reaction when he called me about the news of his return to the Washington Post and his leap into the world of columnizing. I felt tremendous loss as an editor, although great relief as a reader, because we will still, and a new and profound, powerful audience will benefit from what you bring to this conversation. So consider this an exit interview conducted in front of 5,000 people. And of course, we have to start with the news. Both of us found ourselves having to write about Charlottesville this week, and that is a particularly difficult of our many national tragedies and conflicts that we've wrestled with. And so I wonder how you, particularly in your new role, not writing the news, but writing what you make of it, how you thought about it.
Well, it's my great pleasure to be here in one of my favorite places on earth, and the home of free and open-minded dialogue in good faith. It's been going on here uninterrupted longer than perhaps anywhere on the face of the earth, with the possible exception of those rooms you had at New College in Oxford, where it may have gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years. But and it's a great honor to be with you, because having the opportunity to write for Time's unique national audience, excuse me, has been one of the great honors of my life. And I don't know if I know how to write a column, but I'm going to find out. The thing that I think we cannot keep in mind enough, and I harp on this all the time, and people, if you've heard me say these things before, I apologize, but we are living in world historical times because of the digital communications revolution that is going on around us, that has totally upended life for most of us in this room, because we grew up in one era and we're now living into another one, as different as the era before Gutenberg and the era after Gutenberg. You know, Gutenberg's invention of movable type caused such follow-on events as the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Age. all of these, the rise of democracy for that matter, all of these things happened because of the ability of people to communicate effectively across space and time that print created, that movable type created. And if the world can be changed that much by pieces of lead, how much is the world going to be changed by supercomputers in the palms of our hands? The ability of every person on the face of the earth to become their own media producer, their own media aggregator, their own managing editor for their own mind space. So that's the background of Charlottesville. The United States is a wonderful, open, loving country, but we have always had people who live in the United States who don't fit that description, who for whatever reason are hateful, are exclusionary, are incendiary, and it's been difficult for those folks to find each other and communicate and to organize. As recently as when I started my career in news 35 years ago, the way the white nationalist movements communicated was through mimeographs, inexpensive newsletters that were produced in small towns and mailed to small mailing lists across the country. Today, these same folks can communicate instantly and all day long. New people can easily find them, can enter into their conversations. They can rapidly feed on each other, egg each other on, amplify each other's prejudices and notions. And they can easily organize events like the event in Charlottesville, which would have been very difficult to do in an earlier time, and now can be organized almost like a flash mob. And not only that, but a resistance to that is created in the same way. And so what looks on our TV screens like something that's never existed before is not necessarily any new population. It's a new era. It's a new time when populations can easily find each other and come together, and in this case, come together in conflict. What we hope for in a time like this is a national leadership, especially a president of the United States, who can frame this in a way that is less terrifying, less divisive, that can reaffirm the core shared principles of the United States and put the whole thing into a context. And so what I missed over the past week was that. And we can talk about this some more, but it is, there's a growing feeling that I have in watching President Trump that makes me question whether he's happy in the job and wants to do it.
Yes. I want to come back to that because there's a lot that goes with that, but I'm struck by something in what you just said, because what we've been exploring this week with an interesting range of speakers has to do with ethical challenges in this digital age. And so one of the things presented by Charlottesville that we all hear is that by covering an event like this in the way that we have, by putting microphones in front of white supremacist protesters, that we are giving them a platform. And that the principle that most journalists operate by is that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that you should expose ideas to maximum debate rather than quarantining them, don't cover them, don't give them oxygen, and then they will go away. And that tension has existed in some sense forever, but it is vastly more acute now exactly because of the ability to build audiences and reach audiences that is so unprecedented. How do you navigate that? We are giving a platform to haters by covering those groups in the way that we've seen in the last 5 days.
Personally, I don't, well, obviously, I can't write about everything every day, right? So I'm making choices. I'm distinguishing, here's the thing that I think is important today. So that's an editorial function. I'm leaving most of the world out and choosing to train my lens here. But having said that, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that the free press in the United States should filter the American experience for its audience. It's not our job to decide what the country should be or to decide where the country should go. It's our job, that's the job of the American people. It's our job to try to provide them with information to help them make the choices that they are called on to make. And I think it's our obligation to do that, though, in a way that's open-minded, that's inquisitive, that's fact-based, that's willing to learn, willing to question. And so I think you could go to Charlottesville and you could train your camera on what's a horrible, newsworthy event, a torchlit neo-Nazi march through one of the historical seats of the concept of human dignity and equality. I think you can do that, but can we bring to it also a sense of how many people are there? Why did they come? How did they come to be there? How far flung were these groups? Is this representative of Virginia? Is it representative of one part of Virginia? Is this people, as I think, given that the young man who was arrested there was from Ohio, I'll bet that you had people road tripping from all over the country. And so if you tell me that there were 500 or 1,000 neo-Nazis gathered from across the nation of 330 million people, that makes me less worried than if I think that this could be happening in my neighborhood next week. And I think it's the first and not the second. I don't think we're a more hateful country than we were a week ago or a month ago or 2 years ago or 10 years ago. That, to me, is the journalistic function. Help us figure out what this is. And you need to understand, when you do that, that there are interested sources, not just on the right, who want those numbers to be as big as they can possibly convey them to be. If you're in the business of fighting hate, it's good for you to have a going business in the hate business. And I hope that doesn't sound cynical, but as a journalist, you know, I'm always looking for what are the interests being served across the board.
We also witnessed, as another journalistic challenge in these last 5 days, the fact that from the moment of the Charlottesville mayhem, the president's response came under fire certainly from many in the press, from commentators, from members of his own party, from CEOs, and yet he has doubled down on many of the things for which he was most being criticized, which seems like, apart from everything else, a self-destructive impulse if you have an agenda that you're looking to get through, much less if you're looking to unify the country. But it reminded me, having watching this, of an extraordinary argument that you made in a cover story that we ran in January of 2016, which means it was before a single vote had been cast in Iowa or New Hampshire. And the line on the cover was "How Trump Won." And you talked about his understanding of how the media works and what he had already accomplished, which, of course, knowing what we know now and what we even have just seen in the last 5 days, is even more confounding, surprising, unprecedented. So I wonder if you could explain a little about disintermediation.
Sure.
Preferably
and
without using that term again.
That prescient cover headline it was written by someone on this stage, but it wasn't me. In Silicon Valley, the term is, or was for a while, disintermediation, which just means getting rid of the middleman. And you can see how the digital revolution has enabled that to happen across a wide range of American institutions. If you were in the department store buyer business, choosing the clothes that were going to be on offer at Macy's stores across the country, all of a sudden your business is heavily threatened by people online who are just posting pictures of things that they like, let alone by Amazon.com. The middleman is taken out of the picture. What we saw this year is that Donald Trump intentionally or by instinct realized that politics was ripe for disintermediation. And he disintermediated the Republican Party. The Republican Party did not want Donald Trump, by which I mean the established, the RNC, the governors, the senators. In 2015, none of them were hoping that Donald Trump was going to be their party's candidate. But he went right past them. He went through them and went past them. He disintermediated the endorsers, the kingmakers. It didn't matter how many endorsements Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio could pile up. It got them nothing. And most of all, perhaps, he disintermediated the press. Our traditional screening function, where we say that this has gone too far, that is too much, that used to mean something. And it became rapidly clear to me that it meant absolutely nothing, because week after week, you would see the wise people of the media talking about, well, now he's truly gone too far. And instead, he was practicing something the great Henry Southworth Allen, the best feature writer I've ever known, called going too far enough, was what he was really doing. He was able to do that, I think, because he had a relationship that he had been building with his supporters, with his audience, for decades. It wasn't something that he came up with right at that moment. There were people who felt like they knew Donald Trump from his Art of the Deal period back in the late 80s and early 90s, going for New Yorkers all the way back to the Wollman Ice Rink, where he proved that he could outdo the city of New York and get an ice rink built in Central Park in a matter of months, where it had taken the city years and years and years with no success. He really hit his stride with his TV show, The Apprentice, which was, for a while, the most popular, quote-unquote, reality TV show in America. And if you think about how reality TV works, it's all about creating the illusion that you have a personal relationship with the people on the show, that you know them, you've seen them at home, and talking to their families, and eating lunch, and all this sort of thing. It's obviously highly contrived, but the impression is, I know this person. So by the time he started to run for president, he had millions of Facebook followers, Twitter followers, and these people didn't need David Von Drehle to tell them anything about Donald Trump. They felt they knew what they needed to know about him. And he built that audience out. And one of the things they knew about him is that he's bristly, and he's impulsive, and he's decisive, and he says what's on his mind and doesn't care what other people think about it. And that was the brand. I spent a little time with him and time with some of his staff members, and they were always just baffled by the traditional media analysis that, oh, now he's the nominee, so he's going to need to become more respectable. Or now he's done this, so he's going to have to do that. And his reaction was always, what I'm doing is working. You know, he said to Time magazine right after he was elected, when we asked some version of the, are you going to be presidential now? And he said, I'm president, you're not. Which, by the way, was exactly true. He was and we weren't. It's very hard to persuade a person who is in the end zone that they don't know how to score a touchdown.
Right. I will say about that story, on 2 different occasions, and most recently this spring, during a fairly unusual dinner with the president at the White House, he told me that story was the best explanation of why he won that anyone wrote during the campaign. And he was particularly impressed and somewhat shocked that you had written it without interviewing him.
That really bugged him. He said that over and over to me and about me, that he cannot comprehend how a story could be written about him without talking to him. And that gets us back to this week. When we were together on his plane during the primaries, I had this surreal experience of being 30,000 feet in the air, flying along in a flying living room with a huge flat screen television on the wall, and then candidate Trump had his clicker out, and for an hour and a half he clicked from one station to the next, and on every single station for the entire 90 minutes, the only topic being discussed was Donald Trump. At one point he clicked and there was footage from the Vatican, and I thought, okay, well, they're going to talk about the Pope, you know, the other most famous person on earth. No, it was, here's what the Pope thinks about Donald Trump. In a way, it was like being in a James Bond movie and I was flying along with Goldfinger or something. But when he turned to me to explain what I was seeing, I mean, he hit the nail on the head. He said, see, David, this is what it's all about, ratings. Ratings are power. The question we're living through is, are ratings power for the President of the United States? See, if you look at the response to Charlottesville, you can see it's very important to him to be driving the conversation, to be at the center of the conversation, so that it's not about Charlottesville, it's about Donald Trump. Traditionally, part of being the president is knowing when to step back from stories, to understand that the gravitas of the office is going to compel people. You've written about so many presidents, and you know that there are periods when they are deliberately silent. My favorite president, Abraham Lincoln, or as President Trump calls him, the late, great President Lincoln, because he is no longer living. Lincoln was absolutely Sphinx-like for most of the Civil War. He would make public appearances on a train platform or something like that, and people would be gathered. They'd start cheering for a speech, and he would say, "I'm sorry, so much attention is paid to every word I say that I cannot afford to say a wrong word, so I'm not going to give a speech." And then famously, the ones he did were pretty darn short. They were good, but they were not long. So that's a question. Is it going to be good for the success of President Trump as a president for him to feel like he needs to be driving the conversation every day? And since we're talking about the media, is it going to be good for us in the long run to have our agenda driven every day by President Trump? Are we going to change who we are, what we do, what our judgment is, because he's driving that?
So we frequently will be criticized for, I think in the month of June, each week had a theme. There was Infrastructure Week and Healthcare Week, and then reporters came under a lot of criticism for not spending more time focusing on the substance of those issues. Mm-hmm. And yet, of the 120-some tweets from the president during that time, something like 13 of them had anything to do with those issues. And so the question is, do you cover what the president thinks is important because he's the president and it's important to cover that, or do you cover what arguably concretely affects many more millions of people's lives, the state of our infrastructure, the state of our healthcare, whether the tax code is reformed? Do you take your eyes off of him when he, if you're right, is deliberately making that as hard as possible to do? Or how do you find that balance? Because right now you sort of have a perfect codependent enabling relationship. If he is at war with the press, it's a war that his base and supporters love, and it's a war that has driven record ratings, audiences, subscriptions for every news organization. And neither side has an incentive for anything to change unless the country is being damaged by it.
Right. Which is why I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. It's wonderful to start each week with the important national issue that we're going to discuss. You know, this is Healthcare Week, and you know, by that afternoon or the next morning, we discover no, it's President Trump week again. But that is deliberately him. You remember that Tuesday's press conference was a press conference about infrastructure.
And a very
in watching it, I didn't get the impression
right.
that he really wanted to talk about infrastructure. I hate to keep getting back to these darn smartphones, but just as they've taken the power away from us to decide what these folks are going to hear and talk about, they've taken a lot of the responsibility that we've borne and put it right back on all of you. If you want to engage with substantive issues in the United States of America or around the world, it has never been easier. There is more information inside this thing than there is easily accessible at the Library of Congress. You can and I don't just mean this room because this is kind of preaching to the choir at Chautauqua, but the consumers of news have to decide what is the news you're going to consume. Are you going to expand your mind, challenge yourself, learn what are issues, how do they work? Are you going to find the people who are knowledgeable interpreters along the way? Are you going to support those missions? Are you going to bring audience to those folks? Are you going to catalyze conversations around those things? Or are you going to flow to these polarized, interested other conversations? Time magazine's had infrastructure on the cover in the past few months. It's had healthcare on the cover the past few months. And so these issues are being covered in a million different places. But the communication revolution, just as it disintermediates the power from the middlemen, it's distributing that power to the individuals. And so it may be, I understand the frustration that causes people to say, why aren't you guys doing a better job? And God knows that is a question we could talk about for hours, because the reason a lot of people don't like the media in America is in part because we haven't done a very good job. But yeah, you won't hurt my feelings if you applaud for that. But there's no going back to 1970 and Walter Cronkite. That is over. And the future is empowered individuals deciding for themselves whether they're going to be engaged, knowledgeable, open-minded, questing intellects and citizens, or are they going to choose an ideological box, disappear into it, and just spend their lives, outraged by their opponents and congratulating themselves?
That raises the obvious question, and we've been talking a lot this week about what we get wrong and how, as an industry and a profession, we need to do some rigorous self-scrutiny. How is it possible both that the media was accused of overcovering, miscovering the campaign and this administration, and at the same time got it wrong, missed the story?
There's so many ways we could go with that. There's the shiny object. Well, if you think about what's changed since we came into the business in 1934 together, I think you'd agree that the speed of the business is the biggest change.
Yes.
If you're going to produce a reaction, a news item or a reaction to a news item 5 or 6 or 7 times a day, and the premium is going to be on who can get up the fastest and be the first out there, or if you're not the first out there, who can be the most extreme or inflammatory, you're going to be chasing the shiniest object from moment to moment. And if you're chasing the shiny object, you're going to miss the important stuff. So that's how we overcovered the election and missed it at the same time. The second thought there is that what happened in 2016 was something new. And journalism, especially political journalism, is based on stuff that's old. We apply the patterns that have held in the past to the future. This is not going to be a good way to cover politics in the future, because the things that used to happen are not going to keep happening. The Democratic Party is not going to go in a dark room somewhere 8 years before an election and decide who their candidate's going to be 8 years from now, as they did immediately after Barack Obama was elected, and the entire party decided it'll be Hillary's turn next time. All right, that will never happen again. And it almost didn't succeed this time in the Democratic nominations. So 2016 was a new thing, and we kept applying the lenses of the past to say what could happen. Can a vanity candidate win a nomination? No, it's never happened. It won't happen in the future. Could the Republican Party, which has always been the party of the next guy in line, right? It's not your turn this time, but your turn will come. We could see who the future nominees were going to be stretching out into the distance. Could that party possibly nominate someone that no one in the establishment wanted? No, that could never happen. Well, it did happen, and on and on and on. Could large numbers of people, when pollsters call them and ask who they're going to vote for, mislead the pollsters? No, we've got all kinds of fail-safes for that. Well, yes, actually they can. We found that out. And could the media echo chamber, instead of forming conventional wisdom, create a mutually reinforcing mistake machine? Well, no. The echo chamber over time has sort of sorted out the truth. It might take a few days, but eventually would coalesce around what was going to happen, right? Or what had happened. In 2016, we just managed to feed our own mistake, that this thing somehow is not going to happen. And we fed that mistake right up till 8:20 p.m. on Election Day. When I remember that phone call when we said, I don't think we have the right cover ready.
Yeah. So here's one more ingredient I would test on you, which we've talked a lot about, that we had an inaugural address that included a reference to American carnage. We've had an extraordinary portrait painted of a country that is experiencing an epidemic of what epidemiologists call diseases of despair. There was a report just last week that rates of alcoholism jumped 49% in a single decade. And that's on top of the opioid crisis that was declared a national emergency last week. We've talked about economic dislocation, about the extraordinary weights on the American spirit in all sorts of ways. At the same time, we're living in a period of extraordinary technological innovation, of constant life-altering and life-saving medical breakthroughs, of the longest uninterrupted period of peace since the Roman Empire, and a generation of optimists who are saying we are living in the greatest moment for human beings to be alive ever in human history. That's an extraordinary disconnect.
It is.
And certainly the way, as journalists, we tell the story of what is happening in this country speaks to these two ways of portraying the state of our national body and soul. How important was that?
Nancy pointed out to me last night when I was waxing optimistic about how good things really are, reminded me how unlikely that conversation would have been years ago when I was a thoroughgoing pessimist. Nancy's always been the most optimistic person I know, and that's because she's the most mature and wisest person I know. And it's taken me a long time to live into that wisdom that she's always possessed. To me, the most striking and baffling thing going on in the United States right now is the cloud of pessimism that's hanging over this country. As I go through my life and my reporting and my work and my reading, I just don't see the objective basis for it. We are going through extraordinary change. That extraordinary change in the economic sphere is causing a lot of dislocation. Economic dislocation is not new to the United States. You know, 100 years ago, over 90% of Americans made their livings on small farms. The number of Americans who make their livings on small farms now could probably fit in this room. And they're all PhDs from Yale with little, you know, artisanal vegetable patches. There's nobody in America who is forced to get up at dawn on a farm with no running water and no electricity and go out and scratch a living out of the soil. It doesn't exist. So that somehow all went away, and yet here we are in America. The fact that people are no longer getting up and going down into coal mines by the hundreds of thousands to risk their lives underground and die an early death of black lung, or no longer going to factories to stand next to an assembly line and tighten the same bolt on the same axle for 8 hours a day and go home. I think we're going to survive that. You know, I don't know what it'll look like, but we've always thrived. And that confidence is just completely missing from our conversation. I wrote a column last week about the Democratic Party, which seems to me to have doubled down on the idea that lost in November, which is if we just oppose Donald Trump hard enough, you know, America's going to come our way. Here's this huge, open, unoccupied bit of the playing field called American optimism that has been a winner from day one till, you know, 10 years ago, just completely unoccupied. Go run out there. Show us a future that we can buy into with excitement. Don't just tell us what you're going to save us from.
Right. Well,
I think there's a real hunger for that. I think there's always a hunger in the United States for tomorrow, for what's the next challenge, for tell us how we're going to tackle this, and we will go tackle it. So that's, you know, as I go about the country trying to write a column that's not the exact same outraged, panicked column that everybody else is writing, you know, that's what I'm going to be looking for is, and it's happening. Yeah, it's happening in states, it's happening locally, it's happening in the incredible private sector of the United States. We talked about a data point last night. In 2005, the building sector of the United States, which is this is all the built environment, houses, office buildings, this amphitheater. It accounts for something between 40 and 45% of greenhouse gas emissions from the United States. In 2005, the best scientists in America said that the built environment sector, their emissions will increase by 50% by 2016. Okay, so the data's now in. We have over 12 billion additional square feet of built environment, and the emissions from the sector are down 16%. You know, that's what's going on in America, you know. That's the reality. So let's see a political party or a candidate get behind that, you know. I think there's a chance to win some elections there.
I would say you had missed your calling if you weren't so good at what you do. I have a last question for you because I know a lot of people have a lot of things on their mind, but again, the theme of this week is both about ethics, but a number of the speakers have posed the question about what the media as a constitutionally protected industry. The First Amendment doesn't just protect free speech, it protects a free press, as though a functioning, growing, healthy democracy depends on us not screwing up. And so I would ask, what would you say, would you like us to do individually and collectively to restore trust in journalism, which is at historically low levels, and get our act together?
I could turn that around to you, because you're responsible for more than just what comes out of your own typewriter. And I want to say, because I've done all the talking, it was a tremendous honor to work at time through this election, because the pressures on the editors of our great journalistic institutions, I don't think, rarely if ever have been any more intense. The push to stop doing what we do as journalists and start doing something else, political activism. Not that there's anything wrong with political activism, it's just not what we do. We do a different thing, and you handled that so brilliantly, and I know under tremendous pressure. So my short answer would be more Nancy Gibbses.
Well, thank you for that, but
I also know those are hard to find. I think as journalists we need to be more humble, first off, a lot more humble, more open-minded, more questioning, especially of our own assumptions. Why do I think this? Why do I think this is right, you know? Against all the evidence I see out in the world, why do I still think X or Y is right, you know? And more transparent. Because it's now the readers who have the power, we've got to surrender to that. We've got to say, look, this is my best effort. Here's how I got here. Show our work more than maybe we used to do. And you know, be open to the fact that before or after publication, you might hear something that changes your mind. I'm not going to name names, but we all know there are plenty of journalists who have bully pulpits, who are at a point in their lives or careers where nothing that could happen or be said or be done would change their minds about anything. That to me is not journalism. So.
Thank you to Nancy and David for an incredible conversation that will now continue with all of you. If you are exiting to head to other programming, or if you're just resituating yourselves in seats as they become available. We ask that you do that as quietly as possible so that we can continue our dialogue. Just a reminder that there are 3 additional ways to participate in our conversation today. One is on online.chq.org. We're also live streaming on Facebook, and you can participate in the conversation via Twitter at #CHQ2017. We had an opportunity earlier this week. Chautauqua has a journalism committee that's helping us think through how journalism shows up in the narrative of what we do at Chautauqua. And one of the things that was raised there, David, that speaks to some of the things you hit on, the speed of the business, the personality building traits of journalists, whereas journalists didn't used to be the personalities, was a conversation about sources and sourcing, and that codes of ethics for journalists may need to look at more rigorous denotations of sourcing. What's your perspective on how journalism has perhaps thought differently about attributing its sources? Who's doing that well? How are journalists thinking about proving the source material? Because one of the things that these journalists said was, in those journalistic outposts that are considered echo chambers, it's extremely easy, if you don't have to be rigorous in your sourcing and saying this is truth or this is truth, same topic, 2 different perspectives, both of which are being claimed as truth.
Right. We have a lot of technology now where we can link inside the stories to supporting documentation. You know, when I wrote that, I didn't pull that statistic about greenhouse gas emissions out of my head. I learned it last week from a report, and you know, when I write about it, I can link the report into the story, and it shows up as a hot link, and anybody who wants to check my facts or say, where on earth did he get that, you know, can click on the button and off they go. I think that's a powerful tool that will be easier and easier to use. And it's something that the engaged news consumer that I talked about earlier needs to do once in a while. You know, where are these hot links going exactly? You know, and do they in fact support what's being said? That doesn't touch, though, on the epidemic of blind sourcing in political writing. And that's not a new problem. That's been around as long as we've been doing this. And every news organization I've ever worked at has every few years a committee that gets together of senior editors, and they talk through what are our sourcing policies going to be, and this usually results in a memo of some great length and detail with rules of the road for sourcing, and it often goes into the official handbook of the institution, and within a few months we're right back to where we were before. So I guess I'd say I'm not sure that's ever going to end. I mean, you have to do let through some blind sourcing at time.
Well, particularly now in this, this is a very unusual White House. It's been, likened to, a sort of Game of Thrones red wedding, and a lot of what we know that has often ultimately been confirmed by the president himself started out as a piece of information that came from someone who did not want their identity revealed. And so you're right that it's always been a balancing act. I do think we are in a more acute period, both because of the nature of the internal dynamic of this administration, which is critically important, but it's also true in our coverage of important stories overseas, where people talking to reporters is not just a career-threatening, it can be a life-threatening risk. And we need to take very seriously the fact that if we are willing to offer people protection in order to find out what's going on, that that is something that we will go to court or go to jail to protect.
Right. Absolutely. So it comes down, I think, over time to the discerning news audience holding reporters and organizations accountable over time. And that's hard to do in this instant thing, but I think we're starting to see it. There are big audiences. We haven't totally figured out how to monetize them, but there are big audiences moving toward responsible journalism. There's an appetite for it. If we can just keep our heads in the game and continue to have the standards that have served us in the past and try to live up to those, I think as people adjust to the technology, they're going to be coming our way. The other thing that I've noticed happening that I think is good is there's a burgeoning business in trying to identify other people's sources. And where I saw this done particularly well was just today, and I forget who did it, NBC, I think. They put together a series of clips showing that every time the president had sort of done something that would outrage the zip codes around Time headquarters in Manhattan, the following day there would be an unsourced story reporting that Ivana Trump and Jared Kushner tried so hard to keep him from doing that and unfortunately failed. And so you can see this transmission belt that, oh gee, this is going to get us in trouble with our friends back home. They're not going to like this, so we're going to need to leak the idea that we really tried to keep it from happening. I think that's healthy. I don't think trying to out the source for a story where careers and lives are at stake is a healthy thing to do. But pulling back the curtain a little bit on how interested parties inside our government play the sourcing game to their own advantage, I think that's very healthy.
Yeah.
Mentioned the power of media consumers in this age, and one of our guests is asking you to speak, or both of you to speak, to the power of consumer boycotts, and specifically brings up the cancellation of the O'Reilly factor as an example of how audiences also participate in this. Can you speak to consumer boycotts or the consumer's role in navigating this media landscape? You know,
it's a very tricky one. We're seeing it happening more often. Every news organization is threatened, with boycotts. And obviously, that power has always existed, because anytime that you think that whether it's a television show or a newspaper or any news source is not behaving as you would like, you can turn them off, change the channel, cancel your subscription. And so that feedback has always existed. There are occasions now, though, and again, it's amplified by the ability to activate a crowd and fuel outrage, that starts to feel like suppression of speech. And I'd be hard-pressed to always know where that line is, but a fascinating example was the calls for boycotts and the blowback to NBC and Megyn Kelly for her interview with the conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. And this goes back to, why are you giving someone with these hateful views this platform? And the answer that a lot of journalists will give is that ignoring him doesn't mean that he vanishes. He has millions of followers and the ear of the President of the United States, and so wishing that were not the case and not covering it is not the way any news organizations' reflexes really work, and yet there was tremendous opposition, tremendous blowback, calls for boycotts to that. So there's a place where it gets into a risk of suppression, and I always think that the answer to hateful speech is more speech. And so that's where boycotts can make me nervous. I don't know, maybe you disagree.
No, I agree. I always think when I hear this argument that if the press, mainstream press, would just ignore Alex Jones, or I once profiled Glenn Beck for the cover of Time when he was at his hottest, and there was got a lot of criticism. You're just you know, advancing. And I think of the kids that think if they close their eyes, no one can see them. You know, I disappeared. You know, that's not how it works. You know, and it's a free country, and if people want to listen to Alex Jones, they can, whether Megyn Kelly wants that to be the case or not, or NBC brass, or the advertisers at Procter & Gamble. The specifics of the O'Reilly boycott, I would argue, are not as simple as just a boycott was organized and it was successful, so let's have some more. It was successful because, A, it involved financial liability for Fox News. He was accused of, and credibly accused of, potentially expensive offenses for the company. And the company is in the process of a generational transition from the founder, Rupert Murdoch, to his sons. And his sons they live in a different world, and they have a different view of what Fox should be. So all those things are going on at the same time.
Both from Twitter and in the audience here, commenting on the comment about a lack of optimism, and how asking one or both of you to comment on, for half of the country there is optimism for what President Trump is doing, and how are you thinking about covering that, and how are you thinking about, as media folks, that for half the country that elected the current president, there's not a lack of optimism. This is what they wanted.
Well, first I'd test the theory a little bit. I don't think half the country was optimistic in casting their votes for Trump. It was the most pessimistic election of my 30-odd career of covering presidential politics. The two candidates were both deeply unpopular. And the number of people who cast votes feeling they were choosing the lesser of two lessers was the decisive voting bloc. So, but having said that, there are people who have come to believe that the establishment of the United States, however you define it, and you and I are part of it, and probably this place, but certainly the elected governments from both parties, and the permanent government of bureaucracy and career people, and the intellectual leadership of the United States, that however you define that this group has ill-served the nation over the past however many years you want to define it, a generation, 50 years, that this has been insidery, self-serving, self-dealing, self-satisfied, and that it needs to be broken up. And that was not new with Donald Trump. In 2008, we had a candidate who was not embraced by the establishment of his party, who did not have much political experience, not quite as inexperienced as Trump, but pretty darn close, who did not look like any president we had ever had before, who steamrolled through the election, in part because he seemed to represent an opportunity to fundamentally change the way things are done in the United States. And so I know a lot of people find it baffling that you could have Obama voters who became Trump voters, but that's who those people were. They were hoping they were going to get the swamp drained in 2008, and they turn around, they're going to try it again, even more dramatically. So when they turn on their TV, and we in the media and the elected parties and the permanent government and the intellectuals and all these people are screaming about how bad Trump is, a lot of them, and these include some of my neighbors and friends, they say he must be doing something right. If all those people are mad, maybe we're finally getting change. And that, I think, needs to be respected. I mean, at I have a men's book club, and we get together 6 times a year, and wonderful guy, Kent, great hardline conservative small businessman, classic Midwest Republican, and he was in an argument with the liberal Presbyterian minister in the group, and they were going back and forth about Trump, and Kent finally said, all I know is I really like his enemies. He's got all the right enemies.
All I would add to that is that as journalists, typically we covered more what the president said than what people heard. And so he could say something, whether about proposing a Muslim ban or that John McCain was not a war hero or any of these things, and journalists would say, that's unsayable, that's unthinkable, that's disqualifying. And what a great many voters heard was his willingness to say the unsayable. And that even if they disagreed with the expression, even if they disagreed with picking a fight with Judge Curiel or with the Khan family, and they believed John McCain is a war hero, that the meta message was, I am willing to say and do things that right-thinking people have never been willing to say and do, and that is what Washington needs now. And so if we miss the level of despair at the dysfunction, and as you say, the self-dealing that had been going on for a very long time, and the risks people were willing to take with a very untested candidate because of a belief that something must be done, radical and dramatic, in order for this country to move forward, that is, I think, a spirit that will abide. It abided long before this president, it will abide after, and speaks to fundamental challenges to our institutions, all of which the media, our lawmakers, our courts, our private sector, our public sector, that needs to be taken very seriously.
We could continue the conversation for hours, and we have about a minute left, and I will share the rest of the questions with you because they're thought-provoking. But in a minute or less for both of you, what can the media do to regain trust, and how should young journalists be thinking about that as they enter the field?
Work harder, think harder, report harder, and be more humble. That's about what I got. Get more interested in the world out there, less interested in the world in here.
I got to return home yesterday morning and speak to the very talented young crew at the Daily, and I told them, for all you are hearing about the sorry state of journalism, as it happens, this is also the golden age of journalism. I'm delighted, if still bitter, that you all will be hearing from Marty Baron tomorrow, the extraordinary editor of the Washington Post, who has brought an important institution off of life support back into the center of the national conversation. I think that yes, the challenges are great, but if we do our jobs well, we will regain the trust by earning it.
Thank you, Nancy and David.
Thank you, dear.